Good evening, and welcome to the Gospel Light Radio Show. Whether or not you are watching on Facebook Live, which is a new feature for us, or if you are listening on the radio the way we normally do the show. Again, this is Glenn McMillan, and if you've been listening to the Gospel Light Radio Show for any length of time, I've been doing a series on the religious denomination, quote unquote, that we call the nuns. That is the group of Americans who claim no religious affiliation. And it's a milestone has been achieved in the last few weeks. Pew Research Center has announced that the nuns have become the single largest religious denomination in America, surpassing the evangelicals and the Catholics and the mainline Christians in order to be number one. They now stand at approximately 23% of the population, compared to the evangelicals 22.9% and the Catholics 20% and the mainline churches 15%. Now, with this announcement comes the prognostication or the prediction that Christianity is dying in America, that within a few years there will be no such thing as Christians, and our society will grow more and more secular as people leave the church. And I just want to reassure you that this is not the case. As much as we've talked about the nuns and as much as we have acknowledged that they are growing, it is not the case that Christianity as a whole is dying. It is a very specific kind of Christianity is dying, a very specific type of Christian belief set is dying, and for a very specific reason. And so we're going to get into that a little bit tonight. I probably won't have time to cover everything that I have, so we're probably going to have to make this a two-part lesson, and I'll have to pick it up next month. But we'll get through the main reason why we don't really have much to fear in terms of Christianity dying in America, at least in the near term. But there are important implications that come with this research, and that's why I'm going to take my time getting into it, and really make sure that we get to where we need to go and understand what is actually happening in America today in the Christian realm. So let's start with Pew Research's analysis. So again, we've set it up with the fact that the nuns have taken the top spot, with 23% of the population declaring no religious background, and each of the various Christian denominations coming in slightly below that. And of course, on the face of it, that's not exactly true, right? Because if you're going to talk about Christianity as a whole, and then you're going to break it up into arbitrary sets of Christian denominations, you can break it up any way you want to, and they've just happened to break it up in such a way that makes the nuns look like they're the largest cohort. Overall, over 70% of the American population still identifies as some sort of Christian. It's just that they've broken up Christian into four major categories: evangelical, mainline, Catholic, and then historically black, and then other Christian denominations, which is five, which is not a major category because there's very few of them. But there's those four major categories and a fifth category of people who would all, if you ask them, "Are you a Christian?" would say yes. So on the face of it, it's already an arbitrary categorization. But it is noteworthy that fully 23% of the population, if you ask them what religion you are, would say, I don't have a religion. That's more than any denomination, any single denomination put together. You can quote or can boast, and it's only if you look at Christianity in the aggregate that you get a number that's bigger than that number. So that in and of itself is fairly significant, even though it's not as significant as it may seem on its face. So what is actually happening? How did we get to this place where the people who declare themselves as none have risen so much, and where are these people who are nuns coming from? If the nun group is rising as a percentage, that means, uh, of course, that something else must be falling as a percentage. And what you see when you drill down on the data that Pew presents is that it's not an across the board decline in the Christian world. In fact, if you look at the major Christian categories, evangelicals are pretty much flat. Uh, there's a little bit of fluctuation downward in the last couple years, but it's within their historical normal fluctuation. So, on the whole, it's pretty much flat. The same for Catholics, pretty much same percentage that it's always been. It's gone down from back in the 70s, but it's been fairly flat for the last 30 years. Um, and that's still the case. Historically black churches, which is interesting, and we will get to why in a little bit, they are flat. Again, a little bit of fluctuation. Actually, their fluctuation is actually up a tick, uh, but it's within historical norms. Other Christian denominations, the uh, Jehovah's Witnesses and the what we would barely qualify as Christian, but they consider themselves to be Christians. They are again relatively flat. So if all of those Christian denominations are pretty much the same, they've always been where they are, and they haven't been changing. What is happening? Well, I didn't mention the mainline churches, and that is the problem. The problem is that the mainline churches have completely fallen off a cliff. They've dropped from, they were around 40% back in 1970, and they're down to 15% today, which is a huge drop. And so what is the reason for why these mainline churches are dropping so rapidly, and what is going on there and that we're not seeing in other Christian denominations, and why does that give us assurance that we are on the right track? So in order to deal with this, we're going to have to leave Pew Research's work and look at the work of another group. Pew does very good work, but all of their work is framed in terms of Republicans and Democrats and political affiliations, and I don't really want to get into that today. Um, this is not a political thing. I think this is a spiritual thing and a moral thing, and when we look at it from that perspective, I think we see actually a better indicator of what's going on than Pew does with their Republican and Democrat thing. The Republican and Democrat thing is useful, but it's not fully explanatory for reasons we'll get to in a second. So I want to turn your attention to the work of a man named Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is a researcher. I forget what university he's from. I didn't write that down, but he's written a book called The Righteous Mind, which outlines his research, which you can actually participate in if you go to a website called moralfoundations.org. Um, and in his moral foundations research, what he decided to do is that he was trying to look at the ways that people make moral judgments and decisions uh, on five basic categories, five basic pillars, and try to see if those pillars of moral reasoning, those pillars of moral decision making, uh, give us any predictable information about church attendance, about political party affiliation, things like that. And what he found was very interesting. So, first, the five moral pillars on which he based his research. Number one is fairness. What is your sense of fairness? Uh, do you believe that people should get what they deserve, and how do you quantify and qualify that? Um, and the opposite of fairness would be cheating. So you don't, are you a person who believes that things should work in a fair way, or do you tolerate people who cheat? Number two, care, and this is as opposed to harm. Do you believe that everybody should be taken care of, loved, accepted, made to feel good about themselves, that sort of thing? Number three, loyalty. Do you have a sense of uh, connectedness to a group or to people who share your values or share your affiliations? Um, so that, as opposed to subversion, where you would undermine such things. Number five, authority. Has to do with order, structure, hierarchy. You believe that things should make sense, should follow a certain pattern, follow rules that have been laid down, as opposed to somebody who is subversive, who wants to overthrow authorities, overthrow established rules in order to establish something new. And then number five, the idea of sanctity or purity, as opposed to degradation. This is Are certain things inherently worthy of honor, worthy of praise, as opposed to things that are inherently dishonorable, and disgusting. Um, so if you believe that there are things that are always honorable, always worthy of praise, you have a high sense of sanctity. If you believe that there's nothing that is sacrosanct, there's nothing sacred, then you have a low um, sense of sanctity. And what he found was interesting. When he did this research, I assumed he expected to find a lot of different patterns, uh, and to group them into a lot of different ways. Um, but what he found is that there's really only two ways in which this plays out. There's one group that is pretty balanced across the board. They rank pretty much all five pillars somewhat equally, and see value in all five of them. And those people tend to identify themselves as conservative and tend to vote Republican. And the other group, they place value only on two categories: the care and the fairness categories. The other three categories don't seem to rank nearly as highly. And by and large, these people would classify themselves as liberal, and they tend to vote Democrat. Now, why does this matter? This matters because of an additional finding. So, after he found this result that liberals or Democrats tend to fall in this 2 out of 5 pillar category. They care only about the care and the fairness uh, aspects of things, as opposed to the other ones. He did another study in terms of could they understand could each cohort understand the other. So each group was asked to answer the questions as if they were a member of the other cohort. So the balanced people were asked to answer as if they were liberals, as if they were the two-pronged people, and vice versa. And what he found was that people with a balanced view could answer the questions as if they were uh, a person with the care view fairly accurately. It was very accurate across the board. They understood how a person who thought like that got to their answers. Conversely, a person who had the care uh, oriented value system, they could not get to the answers that a balanced person would get. They would always, or they would tend to misappropriate, misidentify the motives, misidentify uh, the the actions that a balanced person would take in those situations. And lest you think that this is some kind of conservative or Republican hit piece, the guy who actually performed this study and wrote this book is a self-described liberal. He falls into that category, the two-pronged care category himself. He was just as surprised and amazed by his own results as you might be by listening to this. So it was not meant to denigrate liberals or anything like that. It's just the scientific findings of his research, which he has published, and again, it is available publicly for you to peruse on your own time. Uh, so, what does this mean in terms of what we were talking about before? How does this match up to what's going on in the religious world? Well, what we find is that people who are in this mainline Christian group tend to be oriented in this care uh, focused value system. The mainline churches of Christ include the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, the United Churches of Christ, uh, the Lutheran Church, the American Baptist Church. Um, all of these churches, if you've been paying attention to the news recently, are the ones that have been systematically rejecting traditional Christian thought and ideology and replacing it with uh, more New Age notions of what Christianity should be like in their perspective. Um, they're the ones, I think the Methodist Church was the one that recently had a big conference on accepting gays into their priesthood. Um, or into their leadership positions. The Episcopal Church has done that already. The United Churches of Christ has done that a long time ago. Um, so these are people who are, again, if you're care focused and love focused, you worship a God who is only love all the time, and these are the people that you will hear saying, well, God is love, and I don't think that he would ever do anything to harm anybody on that care uh, as, aspect. Their idea of fairness from a care perspective is that everybody gets the same amount of love and respect, so they often reject the idea of hell outright. There's an author, uh, William Bell, who is known in Christian circles as No Hell Bell, because he has written several books denying the essential doctrine of hell. Um, on authority, if you don't have a high value on authority, then of course you're not going to place a high value on doctrine as something that is important to you. The rules, the authority that God has laid down, the rules that God has laid out in His Word don't matter to you as much, and therefore you're free to break them. You're free to say that homosexuality is not a sin, or I don't think that it is. I don't want it to be. So therefore, we're not going to do that. We're just going to ignore the verses that teach that. You're free to say we should have women as elders or pastors or priests or whatever, because the authority, the structure that God has set up is not something that I really want to adhere to or listen to or whatever. And of course, the purity, the holiness aspect of things is not important either. So God's essential holiness, that the reason why we follow the doctrine, why we follow the order that God has laid down, why we do the things that we do, is because God is holy, and in order to approach Him and to be on His level, we have to approach Him on His terms. That goes out the window if you don't uh, value holiness as something as high as care, as high as the love of God. When God is love and nothing else, you miss the God that is the God, also the God of justice, a God of holiness, a God of wrath, a God of all of these things that God is and is presented as in His Word. You reject or at the very least try to minimize. And so by and large, the churches that are dying are the churches that have been oriented in that direction for some time. And the reason why they're dying, in my estimation, is because you can only live with that tension, that cognitive dissonance for so long. You can only pretend to be in a relationship with the God of the Bible, but not see Him for who He is for so long. You can only ignore the verses that you have to ignore in order to set up these denominational structures for so long. Because we've all seen the articles that have been published that try to say that the Bible endorses homosexuality, when it does no such thing, and the articles prove that it does no such thing. But they have to bend over backwards in order to try to make it so. You can only do that for so long. And at some point, you're either going to say, I can't be a part of this church because it's not serious, and I'm going to go find a church that does take the Word of God seriously. Or you'll say, I can't hold these beliefs and be associated with people who don't. All right. I can't believe that God is love all the time, or want to worship a God who is love all the time, and associate myself with people who believe that God is a God of justice or a God of wrath. So, again, going back to what the study found, not only can the people who have the care-oriented value system not understand the people who have a balanced value system, but they tend to, in their responses, demonize them. They choose the most unflattering version of or option available to them when trying to categorize or understand or emulate their belief system, which means they don't. It's not that they don't understand us, but they, you know, they're curious about it, or they, you know, just have a misunderstanding about it. They really and truly believe that people who don't think like them are bad people, and it's not a flattering thing to say. It's not uh, a positive thing to say, but that's what the data shows in terms of how they answer the questions. They answer in a way that indicates that they believe that the people who have a balanced value system or a balanced view of God in this case are bad people, or and maybe if God is actually these things, if God is actually a balanced God who is love and fairness, but also is wrath and judgment and holiness, then maybe that's not a God that I want to worship. And they say as much if you read their writings. You know, William Bell will say if God is a God that will send somebody to hell, then that's not a God I want to worship. Many atheists have said the same thing. Uh, they don't want to worship a God that is just in the way that we see justice played out in the Bible. They don't want to worship a God who uh, is holy in the way that we see the holiness of God laid out in the Bible. So I can't see my clock in this mode, Stevie. So you're gonna have to give me when I'm about to run out of time. I feel like I'm going a little long. Um, so this is why we see the mainline. Thanks. We see the mainline Protestant denominations falling and starting to go out of existence because they're bending over backwards to accommodate a value system that is not compatible with the value system that we see in the Bible. And again, I said that I wanted to point out that it's not a Republican and Democrat thing, even though if you look into this research, a lot of it will be framed that way. And how do I know this? I know this because if you look at the historically black churches, their members vote Democrat. And I can say that pretty much unqualified. um, they vote about 90%, 95% Democrat when it comes to elections. But you see that their numbers aren't falling. They're pretty much solid, just like uh, the others, the other churches that have a more balanced value system, and that's because African American Christians, when you poll them on their value system, it matches more closely to the balanced view of God or the balanced view of morality. Um, and their church attendance correspondingly matches the church attendance of, for lack of a better term, the conservative or Republican people who are also Christians. So they are in their faith and in their view of morality, they are conservative. They are balanced um, in terms of understanding the morality of the situation. But in terms of their voting, they vote uh, in a more liberal manner because of historical factors. Um, so the Democrat Republican thing is not necessarily uh, indicative of what is actually going on. It's more that their value systems are aligned as opposed to the mainline churches that are not aligned. So these mainline churches, these again 85% white, 90 to 95% liberal, um, they are hemorrhaging membership because they're trying to mold Christianity into something that it's not. Uh, you can't just say God is love and ignore the fact that God is holy. Ignore the fact that God is just. Ignore the fact that God uh, cares about his people. So that disconnect is starting to manifest in a real way, in a way that is deadly for those denominations uh, that are in the mainline, the quote unquote mainline church. And the prediction at this point is by 2036, there will be no more mainline Christian denominations. There will be no more Methodist Church, no more Episcopalian Church, no Anglican Church, no United Church of Christ. But the evangelical churches, the Catholic Church, the historically black churches, we'll all be still here chugging along, doing our thing. Because we're not getting hit with this blight. Because we don't have to deal with the cognitive dissonance. We understand that God is not just, God is love. But God being love does not mean that he stops being holy, stops being just, stops being faithful to his people. So, what is happening in those other denominations? What is happening in those other churches that are still plugging along? We said their membership is flat while the nuns are rising. Is there anything going on in those churches that is interesting that we can grab onto? And is there a way to recapture the nuns and bring them back into the fold? And that is a question that will have to be answered in part two. So hopefully you'll come back next month when it's my turn again to present on the Gospel Light radio show. And we can talk about, there's some interesting research that just came out of Harvard that is going to shed some light on this topic. So I hope you'll come back next time and join us here on the Gospel Light radio show.